Undertale, released in September 2015. And as you probably know, well, as you definitely know, because it was kinda hard to avoid, it exploded in popularity. Alongside the gnarly cast of characters, the diverse landscapes, and the unique twists on conventional gameplay, the soundtrack helped towards providing the ultimate variety experience. Though one might argue that there may be a little too much variety. Is there a hidden level of consistency within the soundtrack that supports this diversity? And if so, how does it help unify all the other aspects of the game without crashing and burning like an anime plane on prom night? And of course, needless to say, the spoilers are up ahead. That said, if you haven't played Undertale yet,
what's wrong with you?
The first track we hear is called Once Upon a Time. The name implies a children's storybook motif, and although we're not told the title in-game, the melody reflects this concept, being rhythmically and harmonically simple.
Pitch can be raised or lowered by one step, also known as a semitone, by applying either a sharp or a flat to the note, respectively. This is a key signature. The amount of sharps or flats in the key signature represents what key the music is in, and which scale the harmony is based upon. No sharps or flats equals C major. If we add a sharp symbol onto the line that represents F, it is then raised by one semitone, becoming F sharp. The key signature that features one sharp is G major. Each key signature shares its major with a relative minor, which can be found by descending 3 semitone steps.
The lead voice's simplistic harmony is what we would describe as diatonic. This refers to harmony that largely remains within the key signature. Accidental notes can be thrown in sparingly to add flavor to the harmony, but do not necessarily warrant a change of key. Diatonic harmony is very common, so it's no big shock that Undertale's soundtrack makes use of it. However, the bass line consists of a few chromatic phrases, which descend by semitone steps. Here we can see that the bass line chromatically descends, almost as if it's falling down, like how we fell down at the start. Whoa! Another piece that makes use of descending chromatic phrases is Ghost Fight. Here they're complemented by a walking bass, a technique used in jazz, in which the bass line provides a continuous rhythm to keep the pace moving. With Once Upon a Time being the first track, it introduces the listener to the kind of wonky harmonic choices the soundtrack makes as early on as possible. Quite a few pieces in the soundtrack feature passing chord sequences that don't follow the key signature, but don't warrant a change of key either, due to their sporadic nature. The juxtaposition of diatonic and chromatic passages may be a subtle nod to the nature of the game's narrative, appearing quite simple and quirky on the surface, but not all as it seems if you dig a little deeper. Once Upon a Time is an authentic 8-bit NES track. It uses a noise channel for percussion, a triangle wave for the bass, and 2 lead channels. This is pretty much standard fare for NES music. After meeting this jabroni, we're introduced to Toriel, who is accompanied by the piece Fallen Down. This track replicates authentic Super NES 16-bit music through its instrument limitation, the use of the stereo field and the reverb effect, and the fact that it exclusively uses the Earthbound sound font. This piece is essentially an upgrade from the 2 previous 8-bit NES tracks we've heard prior to this. After this encounter with Toriel, we find ourselves in the ruins. This time around, the area is accompanied by music performed on real and electronic instruments. Through these first 4 tracks, we can see that the different kinds of instrumentation that will be used throughout the soundtrack have been introduced in their purest forms. We've gone from pure 8-bit NES to pure 16-bit Super NES to modern sampled and electronic instruments. From this progression, Toby is able to combine these 3 instrumental ideas without the variety sounding too random. It's a subtle way to ease the listener into the instrumental variety the soundtrack will offer, while also building a foundation on which to support the idea. The classification of real and electronic instruments is quite vague, but this concept is varied within itself. The best examples can be found in the accompanying tracks to the main areas, starting with Snowden Forest. This area is shown to be relatively undisturbed in terms of man-made, monster-made things, and the music reflects this by steering clear of any electronic or unnatural instruments. As we progress through the other areas, they become more unnatural and monster-made, and this is reflected through the gradual introduction of electronic instruments. These choices aren't just relevant to areas, though. Themes associated with particular characters have relevant instrumentation as well. When Undyne first appears, all we see is a suit of armor, which is loosely reflected by the use of the harpsichord. The introduction of the theremin-esque synth creates this interesting juxtaposition between the medieval-style suit of armor and the otherworldly creature that bears it. These instruments are almost the generic extremes in representing these concepts. We don't see Undyne herself until much later on, but hints relating to her appearance are dropped through the instrumental choices at this stage. These kind of instrumentation choices can be found in a few other tracks as well, the most notable one being Snowden Town, which replicates a Christmassy vibe through its use of pizzicato strings, jingle bells, tubular bells, and more. Whether it's relating to landscapes, characters, or plot points, the instrumentation has meaning put behind it, and isn't just diverse for the sake of it. Jumping back to the ruins, we have another motif established here, this time based on melody, harmony, and texture. We start off with a solo bass line on the piano, which repeats throughout this first section. A melody line is introduced with some harmonic support added towards the end of the section. We are then introduced to the drum kit, synth bass, and a synth melody, with a little decoration from a glockenspiel near the end of the section. This gradual exploration becomes a recurring theme throughout the soundtrack, with very few of the more notable songs not following this structure. Although it may just be Toby's compositional style, it's interesting that this concept is grounded here. It's explored to a lesser degree in Once Upon a Time and Fallen Down, but this is where it's much more noticeable. It's almost as if the exploration of melody, harmony, and texture is like an adventure exploring some ruins. What? They say that home is where the heart is, and without sounding like we're stretching too much for a corny comparison, the heart of the soundtrack is established here. The player will most likely notice that this carefree solo guitar piece shares its melody with Once Upon a Time. In the previous episode of OST, you may recall that we talked about motifs and how a concept can be repeated and expanded upon to keep familiarity and interest. In Undertale, certain melodic phrases are established and then reused and remixed throughout the soundtrack to associate the given scenario with a particular character, emotion, or place. This is known as a leitmotif, a technique which defines the Undertale soundtrack, and its use becomes the most influential factor in unifying the game's characters and plot. The best example of this can be found in the piece Hopes and Dreams, the accompanying track to the final boss of the pacifist run. The emotions behind this fight have culminated through the events preceding it, with players being educated on the backstories of Frisk, Flowey, and Azrael, as well as the general population of the underground. The first reference we hear is of Once Upon a Time. Later we hear a reference to Flowey's theme, Your Best Friend, which acts as a counter-melody to the Once Upon a Time phrase. The piece closes out with a reference to Snowden Town. argument could be made that the inclusion of these three melodies reinforces the narrative behind the battle. We're fighting for Frisk, for Azrael, and for the citizens of the underground. The use of a leitmotif doesn't always have to be as apparent as this, though. Let's have a quick look at Finale. If we listen closely, pan to the left of the stereo mix, you'll be able to hear a faint counter melody in the background. This phrase shares the same rhythm found in Memory, the leitmotif which we later associate with Azrael from its inclusion in, well, his theme. It's a very subtle audio cue, which may imply that a tiny bit of good, in the form of Azrael, still hides inside the monster that Flowey has become. We could take up an entire video showcasing all the initial melodic motifs and their appearances, and in fact some people have done just that. Check the description down below to hear some examples. Do it. Do it. Do it. Leitmotifs can convey different emotions through subtle tweaks in the melodies, but Toby incorporates other methods to execute this as well. The first boss fight we're confronted with is Toriel. The track Heartache contains passages representing emotional conflict, as the title might suggest. This is primarily explored through the performance of certain phrases. Here's one example. The phrase is performed in a relatively harmless way, but when it returns after the first shift in texture, the dynamics fluctuate very subtly and rapidly, conveying a sense of nervousness. Conflict is also represented later on, with a harsh NES phrase cutting through the ostinato that was established at the start. This performance technique is subtly hidden throughout the soundtrack, another example being Tem Shop. No, I mean, really, the subtle pitch bend on every single note in the melody really helps towards creating a goofy, well, alright, this is it. This is what my life has become. Analyzing, in depth, music that sounds like this. My life is a lie. Speaking of Toriel, there's an interesting leitmotif established in Heartache that reinforces a connection to another character. When we meet Asgore for the first time, we're not immediately told of any relation to Toriel, but the player will most likely notice similarities in their goat-like form. They also share very similar attacks, and once you defeat him, he reveals that he misses his wife. All of these visual and narrative cues point to a very obvious connection to Toriel, but there's also an audio cue in the track Asgore. Take a listen. This is an alternate version of the opening from Heartache. The track continues to reference Heartache in the following section. One could also make the comparison that both pieces follow a similar texture progression, starting off in a retro style, followed by an explosion of instrumentation. The final section of Asgore is also a reference to Determination, the track that plays at the game over screen. Something not many people may commend Undertale for is its use of omitting music. One might think that in order to convey a desired emotion, background music should accompany the given scenario, but sometimes completely omitting music is more potent. Undertale uses this to primarily convey surprise or tension, examples being Flowey's deception. As well as meeting Sans for the first time. Other emotions can be conveyed through omitting music, one example being the serene experience when walking Monster Kid through the waterfall area. So, that's Undertale for you. The ultimate variety experience, supported by the repetition and expansion of musical ideas. Themes and concepts feel familiar, yet are always tweaked in a way that keeps interest and brings new meaning to any given scenario. The soundtrack sticks to conventional writing when necessary, but much like the other aspects in the game, isn't afraid to step outside of its comfort zone. As well as the gnarly cast of characters, the diverse landscapes, and the unique twists on conventional gameplay, the varied soundtrack won't be forgotten anytime soon. In conclusion, Bone Trousel. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to keep up with the series, subscribe to the channel for more in-depth soundtrack analyses, as well as some dope retro remixes. And of course, if you want to give back, feel free to leave a comment or like the video or whatever you want to do. That video on the left is a cool Mega Man X remix of Core. Check out the video on the right to hear some more of my high-quality content. I totally ad-libbed that way too much.